handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seattle. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seattle.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. I've got the distinct honor of having Dr. Samuel Gregg with us, who is the author of several books. He's the research director at Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, and he's quite the academic. So I love being around people that are much smarter than me. Kind of raises my reputation, at least I hope so. His newest book is Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. So we're going to have a little chat about that. So, Dr. Gregg, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Denise, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
I see such frustration about where religion and faith and facts and history are just so being cast aside. It's a whole concept that is, one, been distorted, and two, being ignored. And as a consequence, we're almost living in an ugly world. Would you agree with that kind of half-hearted assessment?
Well, if it's an assessment of the state of Western civilization, I think it's pretty accurate, right? And one of the reasons I was prompted to write this book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, was precisely because of an awareness of some of the things that you're referring to. That we seem to be living in the West now in a culture that has lost confidence in itself, that's hypercritical of itself, that seems unwilling and unable in some respects to defend itself, be it from religious fanaticism from the outside, but also a deep lack of confidence and what I call religions of sentiment and pathologies of reason and pathologies of faith from within. And sometimes I think the internal problems are in the long term a bigger issue than some of the external assaults, if you like. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to say that, look, if you really want to understand what Western civilization is about, where its creative genius comes from, it's really this integration of reason and faith that we see develop in the Jewish world, first of all, and then is universalized by Christianity. And when that integration of reason and faith starts to break down, what happens? Well, I think you start to get some of the intellectual problems that really, I think, are at the root of many of the cultural problems that we find ourselves confronting today. And it's a big picture book. It looks at some of these things over a very long period of time, but I try to do it in a way that's accessible to non-specialists, but also to sort of point out that we're not doomed. Many of the people who are writing about Western culture and Western civilization today do so from two perspectives. One is they dislike it, they hate it, and they'd like to see it disappear. The second is the notion that, well, this was a great thing, but it's basically downhill from now. There's really nothing that we can do to recover, and it's a type of message of pessimism. So while my book tries to show why this integration of reason and faith is so central to the identity of the West as Western civilization, how we got there, the forces that moved it in that direction, and then the forces that tore that integration apart. I also try to point out how in the future, moving forward, we don't need to despair. Decline is a choice. It's not inevitable. If we choose to reintegrate faith and reason in the way that was done before, we actually have great reason to be optimistic about the continuing vitality and growth of Western civilization throughout the world.
I very much agree, and I want to be as much of a believer as you in the fact that we're not doomed. And I guess it's because daily I see all this ugliness, and then I have to research it and whatnot. And yet, reason and faith, I would argue, are the very things that keeps civilization, in some kind of connective tissue. And it's almost like the very core of what Western civilization is about. Values and right and wrong is reason and faith and history. I mean, it's
right.
It's the very thing it's needed, it's required, it's demanded.
Right. If you look at the trajectory of Western history, this integration of faith and reason, which really started around about the time of Christ and then accelerates with the spread of Christianity throughout the West. What's really important about it is that Judaism and Christianity took reason very, very seriously. And that's because, in part, their conception of God was of a God who was love, a God who was divine justice, a God who was sometimes hard to understand, but also a God who was rational, a God who was reason incarnate. And this is the idea that's captured in the Greek word logos, which means divine reason. So God has the qualities of divine reason, which means that if you're a Jew or a Christian, you also believe that human beings are also rational beings. And like God, they are rational, they have freedom, they can know good and evil, they can choose between good and they can choose the good and avoid evil, and that they can be creative, and that no other being is like that. So this was extraordinarily important for the development of Western civilization, not just in terms of things like beautiful architecture, literature. It's also crucial for the emergence of the natural sciences, because the natural sciences are premised on the claim that you can know truth and that there is something to be found in the order that we see around us. So when belief in this rational creator starts to disappear or is weakened or gets replaced by something like this sense that God is just this pure will who can command us to do terrible things, or the converse of that, which is the notion that God is like a stuffed animal, a teddy bear, who does nothing but affirm us and never corrects us, never scolds us, and never suggests to us that maybe our choices are wrong. When the conception of God as a rational creator disappears and is replaced by either of these two things, we're in big trouble. And I think, for example, in the case of many Western countries, the type of religion that prevails is not actually faith in this rational creator who's at the beginning of time, who sets things in motion and who's active and involved in the world. It's really, particularly in Western Europe and significant parts of North America, the type of understanding of God that prevails is God is my teddy bear. God is essentially this sort of irresponsible parent who just lets us do whatever we want, and we'll just pass off anything we do as acceptable. Well, that's not consistent with the traditional Jewish and the traditional Christian understanding of God, but it also gives rise to what I call faiths of sentiment, and this widespread sentimentality that prevails among many people in the West today, whereby we don't talk about reason anymore. We don't talk about giving reasons for doing what we do. What we see is people emoting, people just exchanging feelings. Now, emotions are important, feelings are important, but they are not the basis for rational discussion about things like the difference between good and evil, our choices, let alone the type of political, legal, and economic systems that exist in our society. And so my argument is in the book that until we get back to this notion of God as a rational creator, which is the view held by Orthodox Judaism and small o Orthodox Christianity, unless we get back to that, we're going to continue to be bumbling forward, not sure where we came from, and very unsure about where we're going.
It's almost though, Dr. Gregg, you wrote this with a little bit of frustration, trying to, recenter. You applied some strategic thinking, and you're trying to recenter things. Is that right?
Absolutely, because my view is that there's a sense, I think, that the West is at a type of tipping point. We can either step back and say, no, we're not going to go down this path of self-doubt, lack of confidence in ourselves, this embrace of religions of sentiment, not to mention the sort of very aggressive secularism that is trying to empty out our history, trying to empty out the authentic understanding of Judaism and Christianity that has largely prevailed up until now throughout much of the West. But unless we take a step back and are willing to say, no, this is not necessarily the future that we want, we're in big trouble. But my book is optimistic because I do believe that the West is capable of doing this, that there's enough cultural capital, there's enough intellectual resources for us to engage in this type of reintegration of reason and faith. So those two things are seen as working together rather than being in perpetual conflict. I think there's enough intellectual and cultural capital in the West to be able to do that. But one of the reasons I wrote the book was to say, we can do this, that we know what has happened to us, and to provide a type of road forward for how one might move the West out of the type of situation of deep doubt and even self-hatred in which it finds itself today.
I find that people of various faiths, and I could be wrong, so you'll need to correct me for sure, that they, in some cases, it's no longer vogue to have some kind of commitment to a faith. To go to a church on a Sunday, it's not a vogue thing. It's just kind of, something that, was cool back in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, or maybe in the 1800s, but certainly not today. However, when the Notre Dame Cathedral was on fire, people were panicked because of its history, and it's a tangible thing that we can see, we can walk in, and we can touch, and we didn't want to let it go, whether you were a person of faith or not, which almost admits that they really are a person of faith. They're ignoring that notion, right?
I think you're onto something there.
Yay!
In fact, the front cover of my book, what does it have on it? If you look at it, you'll see it has a rose window.
Yes.
It's very much like the rose window that you find in the Cathedral Notre Dame, which suffered such grievous damage just recently as a consequence of fire. And the reaction was extraordinary, because even many people who would describe themselves as conventionally either irreligious or not hostile, but they just don't get it, they don't see the case for faith. People across the spectrum were moved by this. They recognized that there was something about this building that expressed something about the identity of the West, and even plenty of non-believers recognized this. They recognized this. So that's an example. I mean, did you see? We didn't see people saying, "Oh, fantastic! This is great. We're finally seeing the removal of."
Yeah, now we have some more parking spaces.
Right. No one was saying that.
Nobody.
No one was saying that. And what was also interesting was the number of people both believers and unbelievers, who said this building needs to be rebuilt exactly as it was before. So that tells us something about a residual type of commitment that crosses all sorts of different spectrums and divisions throughout Western countries today, that I think gives us a certain degree of hope that this integration of reason and faith can be reignited. But I think that what that means, maybe above all, is that those people who do consider themselves to be believing Jews, believing Christians, the two faiths of the West, as I call them, it's more than just a question of living their faith. That's obviously very important. But they also, I argue, have to reclaim reason. They have to say, look, these religions have always taken reason very seriously. Yes, there's plenty of Jews and plenty of Christians who have done terrible things throughout history. But what you can't deny is that these two religions really took the notion of a rational creator and the idea that human beings are rational beings deadly seriously. Much more so than, for example, the ancient Greeks, who made these tremendous advances in areas like the natural sciences, for example, but who really couldn't get beyond a certain point because of what I'll call their stupid religions, these pagan religions that dominated the ancient world's mindset when the world was seen as the plaything of lots of different gods and goddesses who spent their time abusing each other, manipulating human beings. And this gave rise to a sense that we can't make choices. We're not really free. We're just governed by fate. And Christianity and Judaism basically overturned that whole way of looking at the world. And what's interesting is that with the fading of small o Orthodox Judaism and small o Orthodox Christianity, what do we see? We see the reemergence of a type of neo-paganism. We also see the emergence of what I call things like pathologies of reason and pathologies of faith. A pathology of reason would be the idea, for example, that the only type of knowledge there is what we can discover through the natural sciences. A pathology of religion would be something like radical jihadism, or these sort of religions of sentiment that I think are very prevalent in Western countries today.
Dr. Gregg, let's kind of go to the history and tangible evidence component for a second, if we can. And that means that we've got archaeologists that are doing work really all over the world.
Yes.
You know, they're doing it in the Aztec realm. They're doing it in some cases where they possibly can. That's not a war front in Iraq. Obviously, it's been going on in Egypt. Israel has been doing a lot. And I think that these archaeologists and these finds are really not doing themselves enough of a marketing public relations campaign on their finds that merge evidence and history and fact and theory where it needs to be, so these people that want to dismiss faith and reason to have within themselves a rational conversation with themselves would have some kind of a renaissance and go, gee, there is something to all of this. I mean, we're talking
Absolutely.
about thousands
Absolutely.
of years here, right?
Right. I think you're right. And what we're discovering, for example, in the realm of archaeology, is we're discovering, for example, how the archaeology that you find in places like Israel, when we dig up things like synagogues that go back to the first century and the second century, or when we're digging up churches, or to flip it the other way, when we do things, for example, if we do excavations in places like Mexico, and we discover that when the Spanish conquistadors talked about their encounter with peoples who were practicing human sacrifice, with cultures that clearly had a low view of human life, and we're discovering things like, well, guess what? They're digging up mountains of skulls. So what this is telling us is that that there is a real history that lies behind different forms of religion, that not all religions are the same, that different religions have different conceptions of God, and that the Jewish and Christian understanding of God is very, very different from what we see, for example, the type of view of the afterlife, the view of the gods that we find, for example, in some of the ancient pagan religions. What we discover with the ancient pagan religions is that God is not a nice person, and there's often a lot of them, and they do not have a view. It reflects a view of the world as everything is sort of predestined, everything is preordained, nothing you can do, everything is fate. My choices really don't matter. I'm pretty insignificant. Whereas with Judaism and Christianity, that is you couldn't think of a more opposite understanding of the nature of God, but also the type of liberty and responsibility of human beings. And I try to show how, in the book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, how Judaism and Christianity basically overthrew these deeply irrational views of the world and then gave impetus to things like the natural sciences and the social sciences, because there was this conviction that, look, the world is ordered, that at the beginning of time lies this rational creator who set everything in motion, whose reason is reflected in our reason, which enables us to know a great deal about the order that he has created in the world surrounding us, and our reason which enables us to master and shape the world around us. So I think you're right, that there's a lot of evidence that points to the reasonability of the faiths of the West. Interestingly enough, I quote, for example, a number of natural scientists in the book, people like Isaac Newton, for example. Mm-hmm. We think of him as the sort of the father of the natural sciences, the progenitor of the modern scientific method, etc., etc. Guess what? He was also a deeply religious man. The notion that the world was purely a reflection of a type of materialist philosophy, he thought was nonsense. He had no time for atheism. He was very suspicious of deists. He really did believe in the Christian God that you find in the scriptures, and he too used the phrase, this Greek word logos, to describe the nature of the divinity. So even today now, we find things like quantum physics are pointing us in the direction of the idea that, look, the world is not chaotic, that there is order built into the world, and that at the beginning of time there must have been something that existed before everything else and which set time and choice in motion. So in a sense, the natural sciences, despite the fact that they're often conducted today in a type of what I call methodological atheism, that there's a sense that, well, there's no real order, we just have to sort of try and discover things. The natural sciences are pointing us back in the direction of the idea that there is a rational creator, and that the religions that best express this are Judaism and Christianity.
Well, I mean, if there wasn't evidence and things that were certainly left behind, civilization would have broken down centuries ago. So it's easy to agree with your argument, and I certainly do. I also would say we've been living under this cockamamie notion that in the United States that we have to separate religion from education and from government, separation of church and state nonsense. But the approach that you've taken in your book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, I would say would be an excellent textbook, because you're applying strategic, factual, historical components to this, and not promoting a something against this notion of separation of church and state. Congratulations on this book. I mean, I'm just very delighted to be able to speak with you on this, ladies and gentlemen. It is hitting the bookshelves now, so please go grab it. Dr. Samuel Gregg, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. very good speaking with you, and it's been a pleasure having you. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, where it is heard worldwide on Mojo 50. I've got Mr. Fred Lucas with us, who is with Heritage Foundation, and he's written a pretty interesting piece over at the Daily Signal. Very happy that he did, because actually it's a topic that I don't think it really got covered the way it much at all in the news, and that is on cleaning up voter rolls, especially in California. So this was as a result of a lawsuit. So we're going to kind of discuss this because it's got some major implications. But thanks, Fred, for joining us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Judicial Watch, who seems to be doing most of the work that the Department of Justice ought to be doing, is to be commended for the lawsuit against. Let's see, what is it?
It was against Los Angeles County specifically. But,
okay.
Yeah, but we did see the California Secretary of State's office involved within the settlement, and some means in terms of providing training and manuals and ordering actually the other 58 counties in California to comply with this settlement, in which we saw Los Angeles will now be trying to clean up their voter rolls about 1.5 million. They confirmed actually to me just yesterday after the story was published that they did send out all 1.5 million notices to residents or registered voters, I should say, within Los Angeles County. Those registered voters could be dead or alive, or maybe living there or not. But
or fake.
We should know soon.
Or fake. Well, I mean, 1.5 million inactive registrations sounds like a lot, if you're not in California. But that is actually just in Los Angeles County, correct?
Right. That is in one county in the state. Now it's the largest county in the state, possibly the largest county in the United States. I don't know that right all, but it's more than 10 million people in this specific county.
Is there some law that was already on the books, Fred, that says that California and or any other state or Secretary of State's office, in fact, are supposed to be cleaning up their voter rolls anyway? There
actually is, and there was a Supreme Court precedent on this. Came out of the Houston decision. Came out of Ohio just last year, I believe, and in which it upheld an Ohio law that said that they can clean these voter rolls to make sure ineligible voters, mass number of ineligible voters, are not on this. And it's a pretty reasonable process because when a lot of people who are against this, a lot of people who, quite frankly, don't really care too much about election integrity, they try to put scary sounds to this, saying, "Oh, they're purging the voter rolls." That's not actually how it's happening. It's a pretty reasonable process. They send out postcards to people who have not voted in the over the last 4 years of elections, and I just ask someone to check a box on this postcard as to whether this is you and whether you live here, and this voter registration information is accurate. If someone does not return a card at all, then after another 4 years, and then they will be removed from the voter rolls. So it's not as if people are chomping at the bit to remove people from voter rolls in some kind of mass purge. This is really at least a minimum of an 8-year process.
Well, that is key here, because it almost sounds like, okay, you go through, you write a software program, you go through a database, you send out some postcards, you got 90 days to respond. After 90 days, the 91st day, you're purged. It isn't like that at all. I mean, we're going to go through some election cycles here.
This purge is like extreme hyperbole from people, but I've heard that a lot from certain folks who are advocating, and I don't think they necessarily have the best intentions when they do advocate that, but it makes for a really good soundbite.
Why would anybody be against having a pristine voter registration database?
Well, I hate to impugn motives, but there are
Go ahead.
there are people out there who like to play mischief with the ballots. I was actually I went to Edinburgh, Texas, this is a totally different state, but recently, but to cover what is allegedly was a massive voter fraud ring there. You had 19 people were arrested through the Texas State Attorney General's office, and then ultimately the mayor and his wife were arrested for allegedly importing voters, having people come in from other cities and towns to register in this city in order to vote in a mayor's race. I mean, this type of thing is happening pretty much everywhere, and yeah, there is a motivation for people to try to keep the voter rolls clean, and there's not a foolproof way to do it, but this is one means of making sure, we always hear about the proverbial dead voters out there,
or fake ones,
right?
What else?
Not literally dead voters, but people voting in the names of people who are deceased, and might vote 2 or 3 times, but use a different name. So.
Well, Fred, let me ask this question, especially in Los Angeles County, because there's such there's an illegal component, illegal migrant, people number, whatever that is, and then you have a homeless component. I would think that those databases, if you will, are used for other purposes, and it seems to me it is used for jury selection too. So I guess I would say there's a lot of motivation, for one, cleaning this thing up, but two, that they already know some number of the 1.5 million in Los Angeles County that should be removed by virtue of non-respondents, right?
Right. I mean, we're not going to fully know. I mean, how many did not respond and how many will be removed as of yet. But it's whoever doesn't respond, I guess this year there's going to be another 4-year process. So that they would have to miss anybody who doesn't respond to this batch that went out of notices would have to still miss another 2 elections. So even that is not foolproof, right? I mean, people could take these phony names, phony addresses of people who are registered but aren't really living there and still go out and cast, illegal votes potentially at the worst case scenario.
Was there a monetary settlement? Like, was there a fine because Los Angeles County had not been complying with law, or was it just, hey, you better go do this, and that's all there was?
It's as far as I know, there's not a monetary fine involved here. I think it's enforceable by a court that they can be required to do this. And so far, Los Angeles County has done the first step of what they're supposed to do. They did send out the notices. They were resistant to that in the beginning before this lawsuit. So that's, I think a good sign. Interestingly enough, President Trump brought this actual settlement up during the Meet the Press interview with Chuck Todd. Now, he got some details wrong a little bit. I was speaking about sort of a stream of conscience, and he said that in the settlement, 1 million people admitted to voting illegally. That wasn't exactly
no. He does
what
kind
was
of
in this, as we talked about. but I mean, this settlement is getting some attention. I mean, it's got some attention within the White House, even if the president didn't recite every chapter and verse detail correctly, to say the least.
Now, Los Angeles County, in this settlement, are they required to reach out to other counties? Because, I mean, they moved out of Los Angeles County, but they may have moved over to San Diego or Orange County or, Sacramento or something.
Well, yeah, that is where the State Secretary of State comes in. He's the chief election official there, Alex Padilla. The Secretary of State's office actually did respond for this story to the Daily Signal, in which they were actually quite very, very aggressive, saying that we weren't forced to do this, that we were going to do all these things anyway in terms of notifying the county. We had to comply with the National Voter Registry, and so forth and so on. I tried to follow back with, so is this completely divorced from the settlement? Is it the timing of doing these notifications just coincidental? They didn't follow up with that. So, but yeah, this was something I think that they want. The Secretary of State's office was not a direct member of the. Well, I mean, they did within the settlement. They did agree with this, but they would like to be able to say that they were going to do all these things, irregardless of whether there had been a Los Angeles County settlement.
And you believed her, right?
Of course. If a government official tells you something, you must
always tell you the truth.
Right.
Is there a component in this that they also have to necessarily reach out to the other states? Because, we've got some number of people that have just bailed out of California too.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing in this about other states, I mean, usually probably a good thing about elections is that they are so decentralized, that they are hard to tamper with on a large scale way. But on the other hand, that can also open them up to more meddling and fraud as well. Or
cyber vulnerabilities, but shall we go there or no?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. So cyber threats are also a big threat, and we actually have a piece up on the Daily Signal about that today. About how the federal government is working with the states to address the cyber issue. So I would encourage your listeners to also check that story out, because that is going to be a threat going in to 2020. Federal officials say Russia's going to try to do what they did again, but it's not just going to be Russia. People are expecting Iran, North Korea, China to try to do some hacking, possibly into local voter registration files and so forth.
Now, with this lawsuit and what California is doing, did it kind of put other states on notice, or I mean, have you seen that there's been some kind of movement?
I mean, I haven't necessarily seen the difference. I mean, this was reached last week. However, I think one could argue that California has the biggest mess of them all nationally in terms of voting issues, voter integrity issues, and I mean. One could probably argue California has the biggest mess of all on any number of fronts, but this is definitely one of them on election integrity. And I think the fact that you have the largest county in California addressing this, even if they did so through force of a court settlement, that is going to spread. I mean, it's going to spread even to blue states that would rather ignore this type of thing.
Why did Judicial Watch pick on Los Angeles County?
They have looked into other states as well, and in fact, and it's not even just limited to blue states that you might imagine. It's they've looked at counties in Kentucky, a red state, also in Ohio, a purple state, in which these places were not really properly maintaining their voter rolls and allowing people who are potentially no longer living there, no longer eligible, no longer alive, to be registered to vote.
Have you actually looked at?
This is something that Judicial Watch is pretty much I think taking a big picture look, but I think Los Angeles County probably eclipses the Ohio, Kentucky,
just at a volume.
In terms of volume, also in terms of just California. I mean, when California is actually addressing this, it takes on a new tone of seriousness because that is a very their governance at least is a very ideologically driven state that is naturally resistant to this type of reform at all.
Have you actually looked at this letter? Did you get a copy of it by chance, or did Judicial Watch get a copy of this postcard / letter that went out?
That's actually in the. There's a copy of it, a model of it in the settlement agreement. The settlement agreement is like 300 pages long, but that's actually in there, and in the story from dailysignal.com, we do quote from it. It just kind of gives the boxes that someone would check for this type of this thing. I mean, this information is accurate, and that this is where I'm registered to vote. This information is not accurate, and that type of thing.
This lawsuit was filed in 2017, correct? I mean, why would it take as long as it did to get through the court system?
It just often takes a while for these things to plot out. I think, and that's not particularly long, given the court system and given the whole settlement problems. And I think Los Angeles County probably resisted this for as long as they could. And I mean, I think interestingly enough that they would not have settled if they thought they could have won in court. And I think they probably once they probably did a proper legal assessment, they probably figured the gig was up, and they probably better just move forward with a settlement. What is interesting on that front, as far as we're talking about settlement, Los Angeles County has vastly more resources than a group like Judicial Watch. So I think that does speak well of the Judicial Watch case that they were able to convince a settlement out of this.
Is there some requirement from this lawsuit that there needs to be some new standards or policies and procedures, when it comes to list maintenance and that kind of thing that California / Los Angeles or really any other state has to conform to now?
Beyond sending out the notices to inactive registered voters, I don't think so. I mean, I think that is the procedure essentially, and that's largely based on what first Ohio started doing, and actually in part as a response to that Judicial Watch lawsuit from 2014, I believe. That's also something I think some other states are doing. They're adopting this notification to inactive voters.
Where did the number, Fred, of 1.5 million inactive registrations come from? How do we know that that's an accurate number?
That was in part, I think, out of the number who Judicial Watch had determined by just like going and researching the voting activity, the people who had signed up to vote. That's how many they had determined had not been voting basically in the previous two federal elections and beyond that the two local elections in Los Angeles and California, and that was based on just going through and seeing taking a look at all of the registered voters in the county, and then who had actually signed up for voting in those elections, and based on the precedent that had been set through the courts too.
So they had done some kind of maintenance to know that there's some number in and around 1.5 million, right? Right.
Yeah, right. Because whenever someone does go to vote, they have to sign their signature. So there is a record that a registered voter did vote at said election.
Right.
And you can just compare that list to the number of totally registered voters in the county.
Now, so we've established that there's no financial penalty, but we may have to go through another 2 kind of election cycles or voting cycles in order for this to necessarily be cleaned up. So do we think that number 1.5 million could actually increase?
Oh, it could. I mean, yeah. This is probably something that will have to be monitored, and I assume watchdog groups, Judicial Watch, maybe some other groups. There's actually another group within the state, Election Integrity of California, Inc., which is also a party in this litigation, that tries to serve as a watchdog on these type of things. So I would expect that they're actually going to be monitoring this as it goes along as well.
Are you
and this probably won't be the last California
Yeah.
jurisdiction to be looked at. I mean, I think they looked into Los Angeles specifically because it is the biggest.
Are you satisfied, or are you doing a wait and see with what you know on this lawsuit?
Oh, yeah. With what I know, I mean, I would do a wait and see. I mean, I don't think anything is settled, and I think the nature of probably any government that's being required to do something through courts is probably going to do the bare minimum of what they think they can get away with.
What about Judicial Watch's position? Do they have some kind of a oversight on this as a result of the settlement agreement?
Well, they did. The fact that they settled out of court means that they can get this enforced in court if the terms of the settlement are violated.
So there still could be a consequence for noncompliance.
What's that?
There still could be some kind of consequence for noncompliance, or
right,
kind of dragging their feet.
Yeah, that's something that would have to be settled by a court. But I mean, there's typically, I think, some incentive for not to go through that expense for a jurisdiction to. One would think Dean Logan is the county clerk in Los Angeles, and it's his office that's administering this. I believe that is an elected position, so that could work either way, I guess. I mean, if he thinks his constituents want to follow through and comply with this, I'm sure he'll go that direction. If he thinks if there's like an ideological issue involved here, and he thinks his constituents and voters don't want to properly comply, I think we might see some rebellion against the settlement.
Does the U.S. Department of Justice Voting Rights Division, or voting whatever division that's over there, I don't know really what it's called.
Yeah.
Do they?
It's a voting rights division within the civil rights division of the or the voting rights unit within the civil rights division, but they typically avoid getting involved in a state matter until the state or local government just does not take care of the matter. So and I think actually, particularly under this administration, even though this administration does prioritize voting integrity as an issue, it doesn't necessarily want to unnecessarily interfere with local governments. So,
but they will and could have their fingerprints on this at some point, correct?
Yeah, that's possible. This or other cases around the country. I think if it's not being addressed at the local level, then the Justice Department will get involved. And I think the Justice Department, if they can make that known, that if you don't address this, we will. That's going to spur whether it be prosecutors or just people at the county clerk level, to step up on these type of matters, to kind of look out for election integrity.
Other than moving,
basically.
Other than moving and have died, what else would make a registration ineligible to vote?
Okay, well, this if someone had moved, and there's been plenty of moving out of the state of California.
Yeah.
But, if someone moves, most people that move, they have plenty of things they're doing, and they don't take the time to call the registrar of voters and say, yeah, I'm not going to be living at this address anymore. They assume, and I know I wouldn't do that personally. I have other things on my mind than a move, so that is they just assume that the county is going to take care of that. So you have a lot of situations like that where people just don't know, they no longer live there, but they're registered to vote there. So you could theoretically have somebody crossing over from one county to another and say, I can still vote here because I'm registered, and do some voting in such and such county.
If any of these letters come back undeliverable, does that automatically make them or have that registration removed?
That is a good question. If it is undeliverable, I think it would have to go to that address. Now,
right.
if a person's if it's got a different name to the address, then in that case it'd be that resident's responsibility to either check, no, this is not me, this person no longer lives here, or just don't return it at all. If it bounces back, that's a good question, and that's probably a legit question to raise. I mean, it may be no fault of that registered voter if it just bounces back and it's the mail postal service's fault, but
or a bad address,
right, or it could be a bad address, or the county sending two bad addresses. I mean, this is certainly a room for reason to presume there could definitely be some bureaucratic problems here. So.
This could clearly be a Herculean task, because I mean, it almost as though that somebody has to review, with some kind of time frame attached to it, 1.5 million inactive registrations, and almost make some kind of subjective determination on that particular registration. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, it could be somewhat subjective, and I think the subjective would be like you mentioned, if it just is returned. But I mean, for the most part, I think it either is returned, or it's not returned, or it's returned with someone saying this person no longer lives here. So I mean, to some degree, I mean, I think it can be objective. I mean, or I think at least the majority of this can be objective. But I mean, you might be right in terms of if there's a politicized element here, when push comes to shove, whether the county will actually remove these names, or they'll start coming up with all sorts of reasons not to after the 8 years of inactivity from the registered voter. Yeah.
Well done, Mr. Fred Lucas, over at Daily Signal / Heritage Foundation. Thanks for the review on this. It's going to be an interesting thing to watch, and we appreciate your time on that.
Yeah, I hope folks will read it on dailysignal.com, and if I could, I hope folks will check my book out that's actually all about election fraud and going back in history. It's Tainted by Suspicion.
Thank you, and more coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Denise Simon Experience on Mojo 50.
The truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. See ya. Over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. See ya out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 21. Grid to Mark. Mike Charlie, 47 Tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark, smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEVT, gas TOT 5 per unit.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. Brian Hodges with Pacific Legal has been kind enough to join us because we had an interesting decision at the Supreme Court that I sure wish media would pick up something like this, because I think property rights just are not spoken of enough. So Brian has been kind enough to join us to talk about this decision, which went 5-4. So welcome, Brian Hodges with Pacific Legal, to the Denise Simon Experience.
Oh, thanks for having me.
This decision was a 5-4 on property rights under the protected under the Fifth Amendment.
Yeah, it was.
That's good, but why wasn't it, a unanimous decision?
Well, property rights are one of the most contentious rights in the Bill of Rights, and if you look at the decision itself and you read the dissenting arguments, the justices who are opposed to the property owner in this case, you see why there is this tension. It's because property is one of those rights that if you enforce property, it limits government power. And so anybody who is in support of expansive government power is going to side on the side that's trying to limit property rights.
Is this case really 34 years old? Brian?
Last week is called, yes.
Oh, okay. I just weren't sure you were there. All right. Has Rose been fighting this for decades?
No, this case, which was decided last Friday, which is Rose Nick v. Township of Scott,
right,
is only a few years old.
Okay.
But it challenged a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court from 1985 that had effectively blocked all property owners from accessing the federal courts to enforce their federal Fifth Amendment rights.
Okay, so just as a review, Rose has a 90-acre farm, not really even a farm, but just land, in the Scott Township of Pennsylvania. Somebody came through there and said, hey, we think there could be some kind of, grave sites on here, so we want to take part of your property and under the assumption that there might be some grave sites, and make it accessible to anybody who wants to come poke around. And Rose was forced to comply until she decided that she was going to sue. And yet, what's remarkable is has never been proven that there were any grave sites there. Is that correct?
Yeah, that hasn't been proven. And what's even more remarkable is that she has filed takings claims in state court and federal court, and both courthouses closed their door on her. In the state court, she appealed from the township issued a couple of enforcement orders when she protested this law that said that she has to hold her property open 365 days a year during daylight hours for the public to traipse across her property, past her house to look at a pile of stones on her property. When she challenged 2 enforcement decisions that had threatened to impose significant monetary penalties against her while taking her property, the city responded when it got hailed into the state court. The city just lifted the enforcement order and said, there's nothing to see here, Judge. The minute the case was dismissed, they'd issue another enforcement order. So with the doors to the state court closed to her, because the township could continue to play this game forever, of issuing enforcement orders and then pulling them when it gets hailed into court, she went to the federal courts because, the federal Constitution says government shall not take private property for public use without payment of just compensation. And this is pretty darn clear, a taking of private property for public use. They're opening up an easement across her land. But then, because there's this 1985 case called Williamson County said that in order to get into the federal court, you first have to go to the state court, fully litigate your claim, lose, and then you can come to the federal courts and complain about it. Well, she had the state courts the door to the state courts closed to her already. So now the township moved to dismiss her case from federal court, giving her no state or federal constitutional right to property. And she got kicked out. The court was frustrated that it had to kick her out, but they said unless the Supreme Court revisits that case, Williamson County, they're going to be compelled to keep her out of the courthouse and to treat her rights as if they don't exist.
Absolutely remarkable. So, she was like the monkey in the middle and nobody really wanted to pay attention to her, which was really a situation that I would argue has everything to do with property rights across this country, right? Correct? Yeah. The true, the monkey in the middle was property rights. It was everybody's property rights. And that's the decision last Friday. Even though it's sort of shocking that it was a 5-4 decision, reading the majority opinion is really enheartening to those who hold property to be a valuable and important right, because it opens with Chief Justice Roberts recognizing that for too long the court had relegated the property rights protected by the Fifth Amendment to the status of a poor relation to the other rights protected by the Constitution, and that it was time to return or restore those rights to their fully fledged status. That is of critical importance because for way too long we've been pecking away at the edges of property rights, redefining property rights in order to make further inroads for government. It's almost as though we have to kind of go visit every single, right bestowed upon us. At least of which would be property rights. Is there any kind of monetary compensation for Rose in all of this, or no?
Well, the decision, as I told you earlier, she hasn't had her day in court yet. Even though the courts that had looked at the case commented that this is probably one of the most extraordinarily suspect laws they've ever seen, and we'd agree with that. She never got her chance to try the case. So now she is going to get the chance to go back to the federal district court in Pennsylvania and put on her case saying, this takes my property, you owe me. And at that point, if a judge rules in her favor, the township will have to pay for having condemned an easement on her property for, I believe, 2012 is when they passed the ordinance. So for, going on a decade. And at that point, they get to choose whether they're going to purchase her property or stop. But in any event, they will have to pay just compensation. Wow.
And who determines that? Is that the state court?
No, that'll be a federal court judge.
Okay.
Which we're thankful for, because remember the federal judiciary was established. One of their primary duties is to ensure that the rights secured by the U.S. Constitution are respected by the states. When we adopted the 14th Amendment, the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to rectify a whole bunch of wrongs that we saw during the Civil War period where states were not respecting civil rights. One of the most important rights at that time was the right to property. And so the federal courts were intended to be the guardians of our federal property rights. And after the ruling last week, they get to return to that essential role that they've been really wrongly deprived of for decades.
Were you surprised at the arguments? on both sides here, and what the Supreme Court judges, I mean, the whole oral argument component, were you somewhat surprised by any of that?
Not so surprised, because the government's camp, has been making these same arguments. They want any procedural or substantive rule that will limit the power of property owners to challenge regulations. They want upheld. And so I wasn't surprised when the township argued that, for example, it would be harmful to them to have a federal court review a law that takes property, because doing so will result in them being declared unlawful actors. It's a really silly argument, because if they violate the Constitution, they should be called unlawful actors. But from their perspective, they're doing everything for what they believe is the good of everybody else, and they shouldn't be hailed into court. And we see that time and time again.
And yet the good of everybody else, I mean, we haven't even proven that there was some good, that there was some kind of, annex, if you will, or, seizure of particular part of property to go visit a suspected gravesite. I mean, nobody's even proven that piece. So it's kind of like the township took something under false premise. I mean, a premise that was never proven.
Well, and that's the importance of being able to get into courts and to be able to get into the federal court. Remember, in most states, the state courts are staffed by judges who are voted by the public, and these are the same people who voted in the township council who adopted that rule. So generally, federal judges are seen as being more distant from the pressures of the political pressures, and can be more objective, particularly when enforcing a constitutional provision like the Takings Clause, which by its very nature is anti-majoritarian, because it's supposed to protect people from having a burden shifted onto them. These are public burdens and public costs. The cost of securing that easement, if the township had done it lawfully, would have come out of the taxpayers' money, and they would have purchased an easement. The fact that they're doing it for free, of course, most of the people in the community are going to support it. That's why we need an independent judiciary, because free ain't necessarily right.
I would think that this township is embarrassed.
Well, I can't speak to that. They don't seem it, and they've indicated that they're going to continue to defend this law, tooth and nail.
When it goes back to the lower court, is there a chance that not only that the law would necessarily be repealed, and that there might be some monetary component for Rose, but there seems to be some other kind of consequence that should necessarily happen here for the rest of the township? I mean, some of these people that are part of this, local city council, if you will, ought to be necessarily removed from office.
Well, that's also part of the political process. If they find in favor of Rose, then not only one of the benefits of going to the federal courts is that we are going to be entitled to attorney's fees for all these years of litigation, including our trip up to the Supreme Court, but that's going to go before the people. They're going to see what an incredibly costly diversion this was.
Tyrannical.
And yeah. Well, and also then they get to look at their lawmakers and say, hey, if you aren't able to properly evaluate how the law works, maybe you shouldn't be making law.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am. Does Rose have any family that went, is that she could kind of lean on, or is she just all by herself?
In this fight, she's been all by herself with
Wow.
the Civic Legal Foundation. Thankfully, Pacific Legal Foundation provides its legal services free of charge.
Mm-hmm.
So, because if it weren't for organizations like PLF, then she would have been out of luck. No small property owner can afford to take a case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
No.
Yeah. And that's one of the home field advantages that government shares is they pay their attorneys out of your pocket, your taxpayer dollars. Mm-hmm. So they have an endless, a nearly endless war chest to take these cases and to grind them. That's one of the reasons why direct access to the federal courts is so important, is because the grinding down process of requiring somebody to go through
they just give up
state process. Well, yeah, or they're forced to give up. I mean, you'd have to mortgage your house to just get through the state process before you even get in the federal courthouse doors. Not many people can do that.
How old is Rose?
Oh, I don't know her exact age. I've never asked. I was raised not to ask the lady her age. So I'm just going to have to say she's a beautiful
senior
woman.
Citizen.
Yeah.
And leave it at that. I mean, this woman, I mean, hat tip to her and hat tip to you guys, because she had some real, grit about this. I mean, she knew this was wrong all the way around. I mean, certainly from the accusation that there's a gravesite, to having to open her land, to not having anybody that would necessarily a court that would even hear her case. And she's been at this a very long time, and it's kind of over, but it isn't over. I mean, it's a good over on the Supreme Court side, but she's still got, an adventure ahead of her, right?
Yeah, well, she's got grit and determination, and that's for sure. And that's what we need. That's the key to success in law and in all areas of life. Is you've got to have that. And she saw it was wrong, and she could have rolled over. She could have let people cross over her property and just given up her land and her rights. But she saw how wrong it was, and then she saw how wrong it was for everyone else who could suffer the same thing, and became very determined that she would be the person to right this wrong.
This person or persons that made the original accusation about having an alleged gravesite, was this just some kind of a archaeologist, historian kind of committee person deal, or it was just suggested, or was there actually something more tangible behind this that person ought to be, have their fingers whacked by a ruler?
I don't know too much about the facts underlying that. I've heard him described as an amateur historian. I'm not sure what that means. But yeah, I really put the fault on the township council, though, because he went to them with his interest in looking into potential historic graves, and the council, the council could have followed the constitutional way and said, look, we can't make this into a law. You can just call her up and ask her. Instead they ran with the suggestion and just declared everybody's property open. If there's any indication that there might be an old family burial on it.
We know that there are property records. I mean, there's some kind of a trail of deeds. So was there any kind of investigation on who owned the land before, Rose had it? That there might have been some kind of suggestion on what may or may not be there?
Well, there's no indication in the deeds or any sort of records of, family burials. And this is supposedly the grave sites date back to the 18th century, the late 18th century. But the land has gone through a bunch of hands, and that's why this person wanted to investigate her property, was because it had passed through at one point, was owned by somebody who's related to somebody who fought in the American Revolution, and he was interested in finding out if he had been buried on the family plot. So, that's about as far as it goes. The fact of the matter is nobody went out there and determined whether it's out there. And even if the person that he wants to visit is out there, you can't just declare private property public just because somebody wants to go there. That's really that's the issue here. Is it doesn't really matter. Somebody may want to get to my rose bush, but it doesn't mean that the government needs to open up. Yeah. And it's a pretty darn nice rose bush, I tell you, but they can't just open up an easement for people to come on and, take selfies with it or take clippings. It's mine. It's my property.
And suppose somebody decided they just want to camp out there because it's essentially was deemed public property. I mean, she could have ended up with some kind of a crazy archaeological operation going on out there, right?
Yeah, well, under the terms of this law, it would have to just be during daylight hours, but still, she has no right. If she were to block somebody's access, then she'd be subject to penalties, hundreds of dollars a day, 365 days a year. That adds up real quick.
Yeah, I mean, was she supposed to, have some kind of bathroom facilities and, water and lighting? So, I mean, if people wanted to try,
well, those are real considerations because the law says that she has to provide access to the stones that they thought might be gravestones. What does that mean? What if somebody trips on her property? Who's going to be liable? Because the township did not go through the official condemnation and take title to that property and pay for it. It's still her property, and it would be unclear. I'm sure if somebody tripped on one of those stones and and suffered injuries, township will be pointing at Rose. Precisely.
I mean, well,
that's why the constitutional way is so important. You've got to follow it. There's a lot of ramifications if you're going to just exercise dominion over someone else's property without paying and without taking responsibility and taking title, everything that comes with it.
Which tells me that the 4 dissenting opinions on the Supreme Court is just more crazy than ever.
Yeah, it comes back to they just don't want to back off this philosophy that they believe that the role of government is to do the good of the people, and therefore, if it interferes with a right, that right should yield, unless it's a right that they believe shouldn't yield. So it just comes down to that, and that's a very that's a view of government that our founding fathers rejected. That was the reason for our Constitution, was to rein in this kind of view of government as the monarch that can do no wrong.
Well, I mean, it was kind of like covert eminent domain. It was like without any kind of compensation at all or offer of compensation. It was really kind of a remarkable thing. Well, I'll be looking for the emails to see what happens when this thing goes back to the lower court. And big hat tip and hugs to old Rose for having the grit and the stick-to-itiveness, and certainly to Pacific Legal, and to you, Mr. Brian Hodges, for kind of explaining all of this. I just love it that we can, we have just such an old document that we can rely on. But, maybe some of those, at least 4 of those Supreme Court judges ought to be, I don't know, somebody ought to go step on their toes. But having said that, thank you, Mr. Brian Hodges. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. So stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide, actually, on Mojo 50. And we're very happy that you could come along with us for the ride. got one of the smartest guys, and I'm just so enamored with Dr. Wilfred Reilly. Dr. Will, there you go. He's the author of Hate Crime Hoax, and if you haven't trot it on over to Amazon to get it, you've cheated yourself. So make sure that you get over there. It is a new release, fairly new release. I think it came out in February. And this guy is a real thinker, and I like that. Kind of a tactical thinker and a strategic thinker. He's also a professor at Kentucky State University, and that makes him, I think, on the short list of the really smart ones, because Kentucky State's not holding him back from being a strategic thinker. But having said all that, welcome, Dr. Wilfred Reilly, to the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Look, your book is full of all kinds, and you've been on the show before. We've talked about your book, but it's full of all kinds of events, and I call them events because some of them, with the air quotes, package them as hate crimes that were really never hate crimes. And you were the one that applied your strategic thinking and investigated these things such that they weren't hate crime. And I think the last time you were with us, you called it a grievance industry. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So I wrote, first, I think I said this, but thanks for having me back on. Always good to be here. But yeah, I wrote the book Hate Crime Hoax that came out with Regnery late February of this year. But what that book essentially does, I became interested after I was involved with a couple of these incidents myself, particularly the burning of a bar called Velvet Ultra Lounge in Chicago that targeted sort of an upscale hipster clientele where some of my friends used to literally go and dance. The venue was burned to the ground. There were sort of anti-gay slurs spray painted throughout the building. And it turned out the owner of the venue burnt it down to collect insurance money related to the building. That was the resolution of the case. So after that and a few others, I became interested in the question of what percentage of hate crimes turned out just to be fakes. And the answer is it's a lot. Most of the very high-profile, widely publicized hate crime incidents in the recent past, I think it's fair to say, have turned out to be hoaxes, at least to some extent. And that list obviously includes Jussie Smollett, who claimed that in Chicago's young professional district, two burly white supremacists wearing red MAGA hats beat him up. It includes Covington Catholic, literally about a week before that, where a Native American Indian elder, quote unquote, claimed that he'd been surrounded by this group of prep school athletes who had chanted, "Build the wall," had threatened to take kind of his people's sacred rain drum from him. Yasmin Saweed, the woman who claimed that 4 or 5 blonde Trump supporters bum rushed her on a train and attempted to rip off her hijab. Eastern Michigan, Air Force Academy, where a literal general had to go to the campus of one of our great service academies and sort of speak out against racism. A bunch more of these. The young black girl in Grand Rapids who claimed that boorish white men literally urinated on her. Kean College with the death threats. Wisconsin Parkside with the nooses. Duke Lacrosse, if you want to go back a few years. All these, upon some investigation, turned out to be fakes. So that's part of the book, Hate Crime Hoax. And I guess the second component of it, I did attempt to use my academic training, such as that is, to look at why this was going on. And you used a phrase, grievance industry, that I think is very, very telling there. One of the things that I found, at least in terms of why these become famous, why these become nationally promoted, is that there are organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, which has a well-invested endowment of nearly $500 million. It's a bit larger than my university's endowment. CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations. There are groups that literally make up lists of these incidents, often without vetting to see real or fake, and use them for fundraising purposes, contact the media to discuss them. So this reality of fake hate crimes is very much part of this larger narrative around the idea that America is still very oppressive. There's still constant racial conflict. And I find that many people, especially on the political left, believe this. And there's not necessarily very much evidence that it's still true. And that's why a lot of these incidents, when you examine them, turn out not to be real. Going out on a limb, I would say the same thing is true for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. That to some extent, there's an attempt to make a story where there might not necessarily be one. Most people shot by police are not actually complete innocents just on their way to church.
You know, Dr. Reilly, I think this is somewhat done in cadence with the left-wing media, because they will report something maybe for a day or so, and the headlines matter because a lot of people don't have time to read the story. Mm-hmm. So they read a headline. They think they understand what happened because of the headline. They didn't read through it. And then that is just a thing that goes into memory. And, 4 or 5 days later, there may be a follow-up, but it's in section, H of the newspaper on page 19 at the bottom, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So there are a couple of different levels of analysis there. First of all, I think that there is media bias. And in fact, there are several different types of media bias. Probably the most important, even putting aside partisan politics, is a bias toward sensationalism. So the media reports on sort of vibrant, ridiculous stories that'll get people clicking and re-clicking. Shark attacks, terrorist attacks, male erectile dysfunction. We're not going to go into that one in detail, but that's something that's discussed at great length in the ads and the stories. Don't necessarily think that's one of the biggest problems in the country. But one is a bias toward sensationalism, sex, war, that kind of thing. I do think a second is a political bias. So obviously there is a right-wing media. Fox leans center-right, National Review. There's some very large right-wing outlets. But the majority of the mainstream U.S. media does lean left. In 2004, the Pew polling service, right up there with Gallup, is probably one of the best too, took a poll of about 80% of the country's mass media national print and television journalists. And what they found was that 93% of them were either liberals or left-leaning moderates. 7% were conservatives of any kind, including sort of mainstream business Republicans of the variety that's common in my family, including evangelicals, including libertarians. So there really was a very dominant bias toward one of what are in reality two equal sides in the media. And I think that affects what gets covered. So, for example, just random fact, when I talk about my next book does look at the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the facts that I found researching for that book was that about 78% of the people shot by police aren't black. I don't really think that should shock anyone, that poor whites or that Hispanics are sometimes in violent encounters with the police. But the issue with media coverage was that the 80% of cases that don't involve black people got about 8% of the total coverage of police violence. So that's how you make up this narrative of only young black men and thousands of them are being murdered. You simply ignore everybody else. So that's an example of how kind of a slight but real leftward bias could affect what the media covers. And you see this very frequently. There's very rarely coverage of, for example, pro-life stories on the one hand, or if you want to swing left for a minute, union stories instead of business stories. So what the media wants determines what you see. Another aspect there is what you could call time frame bias. When something runs once, as you said, that's the image most people get of it. So if you see a story that says something like, young black woman accuses white men of beating her, that's almost always going to be on the front page or the second page, and hundreds of thousands of people are going to see it. And if it turns out that story is a fake, the rebuttal is going to, newspapers don't like retracting things any more than anybody else does. The retraction is going to appear in agate type on page 26 of the leisure and pet cat section of the paper. So, yeah, very often, because of that tendency towards sensationalism, you'll see one of these stories on page 1, and that story will be used to ramp up racial tensions. People get very excited about it. So it'll turn out it never happened at all, but probably 90% of people will never notice that. That is a good point.
There's an industry there. Outside of the kind of the grievance industry, I think there's almost a hate industry. And there is lots of publicity in this. And there's one person that I think was a professional at seizing all of that, was Michael Avenatti, right?
Oh, yeah. Michael Avenatti, the porn lawyer guy. Yeah, that guy. Michael Avenatti actually, and I worry about this myself because I'm a college professor and, local executive. When you start getting on TV, you start getting all kind of crazy emails and things like this from around the country. But Michael Avenatti is an example of what happens when you try to play with the big boys, I think, without really vetting how good you are. I mean, he started chasing the sitting president of the United States around. He started criticizing some aspects of, the Democratic leadership as well. And all of a sudden, he mysteriously got audited and sued. Who would have expected that one? But it looks like Mr. Avenatti is probably going to be doing some jail time. But while he was prominent in the spotlight, yes, he became what John Cochran was for a while, just kind of the go-to lawyer for these flamboyant cases. Where if you had just a ridiculous civil rights charge to bring, I mean, you'd probably call him as opposed to, the attorneys I know in Frankfurt or Louisville. So yeah, that's an interesting example there. Yeah.
But he was out there selling. He was selling scandal, and he was selling hoax, and he was selling sensationalism. And CNN, for example, had him on almost as a regular, and yet CNN to this day, based on the real legal troubles that the creepy porn lawyer has now, they've never said, maybe we should apologize to our listening audience or watching audience, right? Well, they just let it go.
No, I do think that's correct. I think this gets back to the idea of, the media has some biases. I mean, all media is biased towards sensationalism. The right-wing media is biased right. The larger left-wing media is biased pretty strongly left. All that determines what you see. And obviously there are people, whether they're consultants, whether they're attorneys, that are aware of what the media is going to present and run with and that exploit that. I mean, obviously, back in my day, I'm coming up on 40 now, the classic examples were Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, where if there was, a racial I don't know if you remember this case, but I'm from Illinois, and I was an athlete in Illinois. There was a racial fist fight between a bunch of white and black jocks somewhere in Illinois. I think it was Quad Cities or something like that. And a bunch of the kids, both races, got thrown out of school. And Jesse Jackson flew to that community and held a rally around these black football players that had been suspended for fighting, saying that this was a civil rights crisis and so on. I don't even know if the parents of these kids invited him. I mean, the reaction of the kids seemed to be just, let us serve our 6-month suspension, for God's sake. But Jesse Jackson showed up, and, the national news coverage followed that. Al Sharpton's done the same thing multiple times with Tawana Brawley, for example, which was also a hate crime hoax, by the way. But, so I'm not surprised to see the new generation of kind of hustlers. One guy that kind of strikes me in this vein is Sean King, who's actually quite a good writer. Yeah. Who's a journalist on the far left, who's been accused of pretending to be black. I don't have a comment on that except to note that I'm half white and he's considerably more light-skinned than me. I don't know how African-American that guy could be. But he has brought a bunch of these cases forward. I mean, there was a case, Sharita Dixon Cole, where a woman in Texas falsely accused a police officer in uniform of raping her. And it was a la Jussie Smollett in that it was a ridiculous story. This guy was a decorated Leo. He had a body camera on at the time. But this claim was made, and Sean King publicized it nationally for a couple of days and was doing the rounds of the major TV stations and so on. And then the police officer just released the body camera video, and the story just kind of went away. I think the woman faced misdemeanor false report charges. But yes, of course, there are people that benefit from being involved with these kind of stories. I mean, there are people. I was a member of the NAACP for a while, and they do a lot of good when it comes to local business before they start screwing around in politics. But I mean, there actually are people in most communities you can contact if you think you have a civil rights claim. I mean, the head of the local NAACP, the local news. So some of those people make that a profession, yeah.
But there's effectiveness in all of this. Even if we would say, 2 or 3% had some kind of a grievance or hate crime component to the event, it does get traction because all of a sudden it permeates its way into congressional hearings, and we're going to pass some legislation, and we're going to start throwing some money at it, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And so, I would say when some of these congressional hearings happen, they don't even have the right witnesses often that are going, no, that's not what happened. Or so it's this hate industry, if you will, affects us in ways that we have no wide range of understanding. Is that right?
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I think an underlying point here is that the civil rights movement is over and the good guys won. So when you see a civil rights organization today, you should be a little skeptical of it. And to expand on that a little bit, I think the narrative that underlies what you call the hate industry is this idea that the United States in 2019 is still an existentially kind of racist, prejudiced, sexist, hateful place. And I don't think empirically, speaking as an American taxpayer, that's true. I mean, if you actually look at history in 1954, Brown v. Board, final decision in the case, we desegregated the country. The only region of the country that remained fully segregated at that time, by the way, was the Deep South. So my high school for athletics and so on integrated in 1926 up near Chicago. I'm sure there are regional differences. But 1954 was Brown v. Board. 1965, the passage of the Civil Rights Act made racism civilly and criminally illegal. 1967, pro-minority affirmative action, which definitely didn't hurt me when I applied to law school, became the law of the land with the Philadelphia Plan, which then spread outward. So I think that to some extent, when people today, if you're talking about Mr. King or Reverend Sharpton or whatever, try to present the country as a hotbed of ethnic violence, there has to be a little bit of showmanship to that, because that's not really true.
Good word.
Yeah, hucksterism, showmanship, barkerism, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, interracial crime overall, if you honestly look at it, is pretty infrequent. I mean, 85% of white murder victims, 94% of black murder victims are killed by somebody of the same race. It's usually someone they knew. The person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife, or husband, I'm sure. But when interracial crime, watch the people you're married to. That's who's going to murder you. But interracial crime, when it does happen, it's more than 70% black on white. No one ever talks about that. It's actually a problem we need to work on in the black community. So I guess what I'm saying is that the storyline of violent hate just isn't there. So when people say it is, a lot of the time they're lying. A lot of the time the cases that are brought forward are extremely weak, or they collapse, or they never happened at all. And that's what happened with Black Lives Matter when people started unpacking who Michael Brown was, who Alton Sterling was. I mean, the second most famous BLM guy, Sterling, was a convicted child molester. I just want to make sure I had the legal facts there correct. But I mean, when people started unpacking that, the story kind of fell apart. And I think you're going to see a lot of the same thing with the white nationalism hearings that are going on now, the hate incident hearings that are going on now. They had reparations hearings yesterday.
I know.
But a great deal of that stuff, like, is there an upsurge in Nazism in the United States? No. Like, even our racists aren't Nazis. A lot of our racists had grandfathers that fought the Nazis. So you can oppose racism without making up kind of these crazy narratives, like this country is about to be taken over by neo-Nazis. And the people that are promoting that, I do think, have a financial stake in that pretty often.
And, Dr. Reilly, we're also hearing words, rhetoric, fighting words that we have really not heard in the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, we're having Hitlerisms and Nazisms and misogyny and treason, and so I guess the fighting words have elevated themselves to kind of drive a point home, and yet when you start really looking for the evidence, it's just not there. And so now everybody hates everybody. And social media, forget the electronic media, present radio show excluded. But if you start looking at social media, what's happening? You have all these people that are being banned and banned permanently on Facebook and Twitter. So We've left the hall of the Congress with the hearings and, the addendums to, the Matthew Shepard Act or whatever. But now we've got a whole nother layer of censorship. And what's happening to us, those little guys out here, we're self-censoring now because we don't want to be part of this dragnet of this grievance industry, or, we have an opinion, but we're not going to say it because we don't want to be publicly persecuted, right?
Yeah, I think that so what you're seeing in the country right now, and this isn't just my opinion as kind of center-right political pundit, this is what I professionally research. One of the things, the country is getting more and more polarized in a way that's measurable. So, I mean, traditionally, just to give one example, I mean, in, I believe, 1994, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, who didn't much like each other, put their arms around each other and said, hated each other, these guys. They wouldn't even eat peanuts together on a plane. But, I mean, they literally did the bunny hug that male politicians do, and they said that there's a consensus on abortion to some extent. It's a women's issue, but men are definitely going to discuss it. There's, potential kid involved, and abortion should be that the words were safe, legal, and rare. That's a famous quote. And I think that whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, that's kind of defined U.S. legal abortion policy for a while. But what you're seeing right now, because of intensive polarization, is people passing crazy laws to appeal to one side's base. So my home state of Illinois recently legalized abortion, as far as I can tell, and I've been asked to look at this from a legal perspective, up to and through birth.
Yes.
You can get, I'm not going to discuss the details here, but I mean, you can get a DNC procedure through the last day of month 9, which is when you're having the baby. So that's problematic, I think most people would say. And on the other side, you've seen a backlash where you have states like, you might correct this, but I believe it's Georgia, could be Alabama. They've passed a bill that bans any kind of, well, one is a heartbeat bill. One's a bill that bans any kind of termination of a pregnancy, which would probably include Plan B. There's no exception for rape, incest. So that is polarization politically.
Yes.
I personally find the 9-month bills to be much more disgusting and bizarre, but both of them are very extreme by conventional U.S. standards. But the reason this is happening, I think the media absolutely plays into it a huge amount. I think social media, that's a good point there. Social media is probably one of the major causes of polarization, because social media allows you to have this little space that you entirely regulate where you see only what you want. I'm a college professor, and my students obviously lean left because college kids do. And one of the assignments I gave them in one of my classes was to follow someone intelligent on the right, Ben Shapiro, the Libertarian Party, anything you wanted. And people were absolutely shocked that what they were hearing wasn't crazy Nazi ranting.
Thank you for doing that assignment.
Sure, you're more than welcome. I'm going to do it every year. But it's just, if you follow the Illinois Republican Party, they're not going to be saying crazy things. They're going to be talking about the budget. But in that social media space, you can insulate yourself so that you never have to do anything like that. And another component of it is that on social media, it's not even like the 24-hour news cycle or talk radio during the Limbaugh era where you can at least change the channel. Every time, if you have a phone, your tech is on, you're getting these updates.
Yep.
Showing people posing in their bra in the mirror, or, bloody murder in your hometown. Like, I follow the crime blotter. I'm a gun owner. I want to know what's going on. But it's still pretty disturbing to hear. There's been 4 murders in the surrounding cities in the past week. Now, in reality, none of that affects you as a person. Only one of those is in my city, which has more than 100,000 people in it, probably, at least during the day. But we are now constantly aware of all the bad things going on in the world. And we have a filter that allows us to look at them only from our political and racial perspective. That's why people are so angry, I think.
I couldn't, absolutely. I mean, it used to be media, what did they say? If it bleeds, it leads. And that has gone through its renaissance now, because now it's victimhood leads. Mm-hmm. And it makes for a very depressing day. I mean, if you watch, and you probably watch the media more than I do, and I'm pretty glued to it all day long. When you go to get in bed at night, it's like, man, I'm glad this day's over. I mean, you feel exhausted, and the only thing you probably did was mop the kitchen floor, because I guess the words that are used, they're emotional, so they tap into the emotions, and of course your blood pressure goes up, and you get into bed exhausted, when in fact, due to your book, we find out it really didn't happen that way.
Yeah, I mean, around half the time in the victimhood cases, if you're talking about hate crimes or Black Lives Matter cases, I could say, yeah, it never occurred in the first place. And even if it did occur, I mean, one thing I will say, the country is not riven by hate. It's not under Mr. Trump. It wasn't under President Obama.
Right.
There are less than 7,000 hate crimes in a typical year. And a lot of those aren't what you think of as hate crimes. It's some clown writing graffiti on a fence. I mean, as a middle-class black guy, I guess I'm in an interracial relationship for that matter. My partner is Native American and white. But anyway, like, I But I've experienced maybe 10 racial incidents in my life, and those are things like schoolyard fistfights and so on. I think that's very typical. I think if you're Caucasian and you go to a black neighborhood to listen to jazz, you're not going to be robbed by 15 teenagers. I mean, if you're black and you live in Kentucky, as I do, you're not going to have people outside your house playing banjos and throwing bricks through the window.
Right.
Day-to-day life, I mean, if you're a woman, life is not going to be a hotbed of sexual harassment and violence.
Right.
I mean, so you're going to go to the office and do a good job. You're not going to have guys following you around, leering, beating drums. You know, so when you see, what you see in the media is a concentrated impression of the worst of life. Violence, anonymous sex, so on, moment by moment by moment. And that's not what life is like at all. If life were like that, it would be exciting for a day or two, and then we'd all be dead or wish to be. But it's not. What we're seeing is an artificial image. And there's an element almost of drug dealing to this, by the way. Like, if you look at these programs like Facebook, they have what are called massive data algorithms.
Yes.
So they know what gets people, and not just people. I suspect they know what gets you excited.
Yep.
So your news feed on Facebook or Twitter is almost like karma. If you click on something, if it's a story about interracial violence, you're going to get 5 more stories about interracial violence.
Sure, exactly. Well, when people ask me, I get these text messages or these direct messages all day long. Is this true? Is this true? Is this true? And I can tell that they got the story from Facebook. It's like, I know the genesis of this, and I go, come on, really? But they don't get it from Twitter because I don't think there are as many. I mean, it's obvious that people sit on Facebook all day long. And the high recommendation is just don't get into any kind of exchange. Just put something out there that you know that's factually true. And I have to check things 96 times before I put it out there. And then I just leave it. I'll go, I get these alerts. Somebody responded to this, and I'll go, okay, fine, whatever. And I'm not touching it. I'm just leaving it there. You guys fight it out. And they do. Even when people write op-eds in The Hill or the Washington Post, if you turn around and start looking at the comments, the comments, the people are fighting among themselves for something that's ridiculous. So, Dr. Reilly, you've done a remarkable job here. Your presentation and your strategic thinking is so important, and it's a good lesson for everybody to learn. I got to give you a real hat tip. I like having people smarter than me because I have a lot to learn. And thank you for writing the book, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Excellent read. Thank you, Dr. Reilly. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us as we're heard on Mojo 50.